Hey, welcome back to Everyday Economics. This is the podcast that helps you learn about the economic world happening around you every day. I'm your host, Chris Krug, publisher of the Center Square. Everyday Economics is brought to you by the Center Square. To support Everyday Economics, please make a tax-deductible charitable contribution by clicking the link in the show description. We're recording this episode on February 14th, also known as Valentine's Day. And joining me, as always, my friend and colleague, Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Hey, he's a PhD economist. Dr. O, you and I have been talking quite a bit in the last few weeks on the show and offline about the direction of inflation. One of the pieces of data, or maybe it's not necessarily a piece of data, it's a data-driven thought that you have shared with me and that I've bounced back to you. 3% inflation could become the new normal. I mean, the Federal Reserve works hard to get us to 2% inflation. And that's, deemed to be normal, inside of the inside of the country and where your money, the value of your money year over year. January number came in for consumer price index, and it's at 3%, like right on the nose, higher than it was the month before. Well, this wasn't what we were certainly asking for or hoping for or trying to conjure. So what do you make of it?
Well, so just for the benefit of our listeners, we do keep track of the CPI, but the Fed really cares about the PCE index, right? And when you look at the PCE, well, core PCE, it's at 2.8%. So it's going to look at this. But the PCE is going to be the one, right? And the PPI is actually very predictive of what happens in the PCE. So, but anyway.
So let me call a timeout. So we're throwing acronyms around. So, there's the consumer price index. There's the producer price index.
Yes.
And then there's PCE, which you've referenced, which is the personal consumption expenditures price index. So why don't you just take a second and talk about the difference between the PCE and the CPI, just so people can sort of think about those two things, because they're both related to consumers.
Totally. The consumer price index looks at a fixed basket of goods and aims to track changes in prices over time. While the PCE index is constructed slightly differently. And what it does is it kind of takes into account the fact that consumers, when things are expensive, consumers will tend to substitute the expensive stuff for the cheaper stuff, right? And so the PCE is the one that the Fed tends to look at. But essentially, you have two different measures constructed completely differently, trying to measure different things. And so those are the differences, if we want to keep it very, high level here. But why don't we get into this latest report? Because I think
absolutely. I think that would I don't want to slow you down, but we don't want to lose anybody either. Right.
That's right. I like the fact that you asked this question because it's always nice. Maybe I can distill that in the Center Square, piece. A nice small short explainer, so people are aware of the differences. But anyway, inflation isn't cooling as fast as everyone hoped.
Right.
Right.
That's kind of the bottom line of what we've been talking about and what we're going to be talking about just specifically here.
Yeah. It's not cooling as fast as everyone had hoped, but I have to add, it is going to cool further, right? It is going to, let me start with that, right? I want to say, I think it's important to say it is going to cool further. Why do I believe that? I believe that because essentially, if you think about what's driving the inflation pressure, the inflation surprise, it's really all about supply shocks. Supply shock. If you look, the St. Louis, the San Francisco Fed has a beautiful measure out there by a very brilliant economist that looks at the contribution of demand to inflation pressures, and as well as the contribution of supply. So decomposes, right? Remember, if supply shrinks due to, why don't I give you a simple example? Suppose we have a really, really bad winter. Suppose we had snow in Florida, right? Unexpected.
Well, we did. We actually just did have that. So
exactly. Yeah. That basically destroyed a lot of crops, right? I don't know. Do they have oranges in Florida?
Yes,
Florida?
they do.
Okay.
Kind of, yeah.
Well,
they're short of bait for that. Yeah.
So what do you think would happen to the supply of oranges into the supermarkets and the resulting price of oranges, right? It would go up. We had the bird flu. The bird flu has affected, obviously, eggs, and it's hard to get eggs across the country.
Yes.
And of course, that causes egg prices to increase, right? And so what do we have in the latest inflation? In the past year, we've had a big decline in demand-driven inflation. In other words, Fed policy has actually worked to cool down demand. Right? Demand had been overheated. We cooled down demand. But unfortunately, we still have these supply shocks that are preventing further disinflation. I'm talking about energy, fuel, oil and gas prices spiked 6.2% and 1.8% respectively in January. Right? Energy prices that had been falling are now rising again. I'm talking about food prices. Of course, supply shocks are pushing food prices higher. The severe winter storms, the bird flu I just mentioned, transportation services, right? Supply chain issues are playing a massive role in explaining the inflation surprise that we've had as of late. And so, in my opinion, once those play themselves out, by the way, we're not going to continue to get severe winter storms into May or June of this year. Fingers crossed. It's not the end of the world yet. So once these play themselves out, I expect, right, that part of the inflation resistance to vanish. And I expect inflation to continue to move in the right direction. We're just going to have to be patient. And that's exactly what the Fed has been saying. It's been on hold, waiting patiently for it to play itself out, and for the numbers to finally make sense in order to deliver the next cut. And so that's kind of how I see it. Core inflation on the housing side, with price, inflation on the housing side is still moving in the right direction. Right? We predicted that for 2 years now. Right. That it was going to happen. It's happening. Rent of primary residence, eased, again on a year-over-year basis. Owner's equivalent rent in the consumer price index eased from 4.8% last month to 4.6% this month. So again, we continue to see some easing on the housing front. And so hopefully we continue to move in that direction. I suspect maybe that's going, the easing on the housing front in terms of rent prices could potentially stall at the end of this year and early next year due to the fact that housing starts have dropped so much and that there won't be as many apartment deliveries at the end of this year and early next year. So of course that means rent growth will stop easing, and we may actually start to get some rent growth pressure, upward pressure on rent growth again. But that's the story, essentially. The story for inflation is that it's somewhat stubborn due to supply factors, more so due to supply factors, not because the consumer is spending more, reaccelerating in the sense of a consumer that's doing really well and going out and spending and pushing prices higher. In fact, the consumer is somewhat stuck right now. We're seeing credit card and auto loan delinquency rates rising. We're seeing a labor market that is kind of paused, where people are not moving jobs.
Well, you talked about it being frozen, and I'm getting that. Although I will tell you this, talking to my friends who, are in business, and trying to hire people, there are certain types of jobs they're trying to hire for they can't find people.
Well, yeah,
it's technical labor, so like welders and
it's still there. It's still there. But I mean, last week we got the NFIB survey, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you want to know what's going on Main Street, you look at that survey, and what it shows is labor. There's still some labor cost concerns, but they're easing, right? Still a challenge, but not the top worry it once was.
Mm-hmm.
Was straight from the survey, right? Fewer businesses are planning capital investments, a sign of growing hesitation about the future. Part of it is the tariff story. Fewer businesses are raising their prices, potentially a sign of cooling demand. And so you have all of the ingredients for inflation to continue to move in the right direction.
Yeah.
But until we see it in the numbers, the Fed will wait, will hold the line, and we were just going to have to wait and see.
Yeah, I was literally going to just choose those same words, that we are in a wait and see scenario. So, okay, so I appreciate the update on that. For Orphe Divounguy, this has been Chris Krug. Subscribe to Everyday Economics wherever you get your podcasts. And make sure you listen to us each week on the Center Square Radio Hour.